Hello, thank you for joining us for this World Council of Credit Unions virtual event, Global versus National Credit Union Advocacy, Building Bridges for Financial Inclusion. I'm Greg Newman, Director of Communications for World Council. Before we get started, please take a moment to click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and choose your language, English or Spanish, to make sure you can hear all of today's presentations in your preferred language. Tómese un momento para hacer clic en interpretación y elija su idioma, inglés o español, para asegurarse de que puede escuchar esta reunión en su idioma preferido. Today's virtual event explores the dynamic relationship between global and national advocacy efforts in the credit union movement, examining how these complementary approaches strengthen financial cooperatives worldwide. This session will also offer practical insights for credit union leaders seeking to strengthen their advocacy impact through strategic alignment of global principles with national implementation strategies. Our panelists for today's webinar include David Malone, CEO of the Irish League of Credit Unions, Paul Andrews, World Council's Vice President of International Advocacy, and Erin O'Hearn, World Council's International Advocacy and Regulatory Counsel. They will discuss successful strategies for aligning international principles with local implementation, share examples of successful efforts, and identify opportunities for creating more cohesive advocacy frameworks. If any questions come into your mind as we're discussing these subjects today, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can type them in there. I'll ask David, Paul, and Erin your questions at the end of our discussion. And just a reminder, if you like today's session, you can view it later today or tell others to view it on our YouTube channel. That's at youtube.com/Woku. I now want to welcome in Paul Andrews, Erin O'Hearn, and David Malone. Thank you all for being here, and I will let you guys take it away.
Well, thanks very much, Greg, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. And I'm very, very pleased to be joined with David and David and Erin on this discussion today with respect to global and national credit union advocacy. I'm going to kick things off, and at the outset, I think it's important that we keep in mind that it really isn't international advocacy versus local advocacy. It's really global advocacy and local advocacy, because the two aspects really work hand in hand. And that's really what we're going to be exploring today with discussion with David and Erin. And I thought at the outset we should start with, what do we do at WOKU when it comes to international advocacy? And what's important, I think, to remember is that many rules, particularly around capital, particularly around disclosure requirements, particularly around anti-money laundering, rules and regulations, are set at the international level, whether it's from the Basel Committee with respect to capital requirements, whether it's the Financial Action Task Force with respect to anti-money laundering requirements and rules and regulations. Many times those regulations are where things start, and then they trickle down into the local jurisdictions. So what we try to do, what Erin and I try to do at WOKU, is to help ensure that those rules and standards that are set by these international standard setting bodies reflect the business model and the ethos of credit unions. What we find is that many times these requirements are built, revolve around large international banks. And as we all know, credit unions are not banks. So that's our job at WOKU, is to help ensure that the regulations are proportionate to what credit unions stand for and for their business models. And that's really the most important aspect of the work that we do. And at the same time, and David and Erin will talk about this in more detail, but we also help support local advocacy efforts as well. And what that really means is when we come into a jurisdiction that is having a particular challenge, the local credit union league or a group of credit unions may ask us to participate. And one of the things that we bring from WOKU is that international perspective. to help demonstrate what other parts of the world are doing on a particular issue, which then helps influence what that particular jurisdiction may be considering with credit unions in that local uh, country, region, area of the world. We're very fortunate to say, too, that we've had some good successes over the years with respect to what we have been able to do at the international level. And on the right-hand side of the screen, in the lower right-hand side, you'll see a couple of examples of successes that we had. One at the Basel Committee, where they did some revisions to the core principles of affecting banking supervision, and that included key guidance on proportionality, which is the lifeblood of credit unions. And we're proud to say that that was something that we participated in and had a hand in helping to ensure that there was proportionality. Last year, with the G20 and the Brazilian presidency, we made strong arguments about how that declaration should include language around financial inclusion. And sure enough, the Leaders' Declaration did include some of that language. So we persevere. These are difficult standard-setting bodies to influence, but with perseverance and strong arguments, we've been able to achieve some successes over the years. What I wanted to do next was just give you some sense of where Erin and I in particular spend our time. And these are where the places, the standard setting bodies, the overseers that have influence on credit unions and the regulation and oversight of credit unions, whether it's on the conduct side or whether it's on the prudential side. These are some of the bodies that we spend our time advocating before to help ensure that proportionality, to help ensure that credit unions are not treated like big international banks. And on the left-hand side, you'll see a series of organizations. I mentioned the G20, I mentioned the Basel Committee, the Financial Stability Board, which is the international body that helps ensure financial stability across the system, not just with banks, but with asset managers, credit unions, anyone involved in the financial services industry. I mentioned FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, but then there's a few on the right-hand side that are probably a little less well known, not so much the European Union, that's very well known, but that we would be before the United Nations, for example, making arguments before the United Nations. And that's particularly relevant this year, since 2025 has been declared by the UN the International Year of Cooperatives. So we are looking at how we can help celebrate that year in conjunction with the UN's declaration. Then there's the International Accounting Standards Board that we spend time before the European Union, I mentioned, and all of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with the General Data Protection Regulation, which, yes, it applies to Europe, but it has larger ramifications around the world. And then, of course, the International Sustainability Standards Board. And that's really all about climate disclosures and how that is trickling down into the local jurisdictions. So that's where Erin and I spend a great deal of our time in the big picture. And I think it'll be interesting to hear from Erin where we then bring that international perspective into some local jurisdictions and how what we do helps influence those local rules and regulations. Erin?
Thanks so much, Paul. And we'll go ahead and hop in here with a quick, thanks so much for that overview of generally thinking about two key components that we do within World Council. It's both making sure that the international standard setters understand the credit union perspective, understand why they can't just have guidance for large international banks, but there needs to be proportionality built in there or language within their international standards and within their guidance that says there needs to be room at the national level when we're adopting this at a country level to make sure that it's appropriate for the local financial institutions that are operating, and especially those filling those gaps like credit unions do to reach underserved communities. So you have that component to make sure that there is that proportionality, that ability for national governments to tailor their regulations appropriately for credit unions. But we also want to make sure that credit unions at the national level have the benefit of really building off the network, being able to share best practices from each other. And part of that too, though, in your own individual advocacy strategy, and this is something that I can speak to personally as formerly doing advocacy at a national level and at a local level, making sure that we're able to draw from those other examples outside our jurisdictions, but also making sure if there are international standard setters that are going to apply, if there's guidance out there from an international global level that sets a standard, and within that standard, it allows for flexibility. We want to make sure that we are aware of that and then informing our national regulators or our local regulators, those local supervisors, where that flexibility exists. It's out there for a reason at the global level to make sure that these rules can be appropriately tailored. And being able to pull that into our national and our local advocacy work can really make sure that we are not subject to overly burdensome regulations or regulations that really just aren't designed for us, that don't fit for us. So it's another tool in the toolbox that I hope people think about and use. I know that I was aware of some of the international standards when I was working on some of the local level advocacy, but looking back, wish I had known more about some of the particulars out there so that I could make sure that I was drawing that into my conversations with the local regulators. And so much of this is built off of a long history within World Council of a really strong advocacy team year over year for many years, making sure that this proportionality is out there and built into it. So just want to share a couple of examples in terms of where you might see. I think sometimes it can feel very intangible. You hear the United Nations, you hear the International Sustainability Standards Board, but what does that actually mean for me at a local level when I'm opening my doors or when I'm advocating for credit unions in my neighborhood? And so there are a couple of things that I just wanted to point out to draw that connection for folks of why we really make sure that there's a credit union message at every level. And again, that's why we all work together in conjunction, because at a local level, at a national level, at an international level, the goal is really to make sure that the international standard setters, the national governments, and your local supervisors are all considering the credit union message. And so, a couple of examples you heard Paul very well describe the Financial Action Task Force, which sets anti money laundering standards. So, in the United States, that's known as FinCEN. It goes by many different names within each country. They have their own body there to set anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing standards. And then they really look to the international standards that are to FATF, to that Financial Action Task Force, to say, what is the global standard for anti-money laundering? What are those common practices? What are those standards that everyone's expected to follow internationally to make sure we can have a successful global economy? So one of those trickle down standards that I'm sure everyone on the call is familiar with is KYC. So it goes by many names, but know your customer, or as I like to say, know your member. You can see that at account opening. So many of those standards really drive how difficult is it to open an account for an individual? How many pieces of information do I need to collect? What questions do I need to ask members when they're trying to start a new service? And a lot of that can really originate from those international standards. So we want to make sure we're looking at those standards to say, where is there flexibility? One, where is there more flexibility that the World Council needs to be asking for at the international level? But what's already in there that then we could ask our national level regulators to make sure that they are adopting and saying this still conforms to the international standards. So certainly know your customer, know your member. Account opening is one of those. Sticking with account opening, many systems are currently dealing with the beneficial ownership provisions. That again started at the Financial Action Task Force level, which is made up of representatives from many of the countries that have credit unions in them to provide input to set these global standards. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about, what are the international standards really asking for? And then where is there flexibility that we can also ask at our national level? So the beneficial ownership, again, is folks are trying to determine how to demonstrate and track and show, who truly owns, who truly controls business accounts, legal entity accounts as we're opening those accounts. So you can see it has a real day-to-day impact. Certainly financial inclusion, I just wanted to include in there, is a common topic of conversation right now, both at the international and at many national level regulator levels, because there is a recognition after many conversations about where those regulations may be causing hurdles or unintended consequences and barriers to reaching underserved communities, to really ensuring financial inclusion at a national level. So these conversations, if we are running into them at an international level, we want to make sure that we're also mirroring them at a national level. And I just mentioned quickly, just another quick example. You saw a lot over the last 5 years around what disclosures are going to be needed in terms of measuring environmental, social, and governance causes. The S1, S2 disclosures are really around climate change. We're seeing some national governments, I'd point out Brazil, Canada, and others, that are really looking at those international standards and saying, how do we adopt these into some of our national level work? And how do we make sure that the ones that we want to create and start on our own at a national level also are in harmony with the international standard setters? And I would point out too that, we'll hear a little bit more on the European Union side in just a minute, but that all of those standards really are driving some of these social taxonomy conversations as well. And so I think we'll have just a quick example I want to point out. We've talked a lot about the international standard level, and we'll have a national example here in just a minute with David Malone joining us. But wanted to point out there's so many good learnings from each other that I hope that we're able to take and work together. So we mentioned the first part in terms of the international standard setters, making sure that there are opportunities for flexibility that then national and regional and local credit unions are aware of, so they can advocate for those at a local level. There's also great best practices and work that can be done together. And so I'd share the Cayman Islands example. They had a very a quick turnaround with a short time frame to respond to a sudden and huge increase in terms of the fees that they would be assessed. And they did such quality work in engaging with their local members, making sure they were writing letters, hopping on radio calls, having public announcements within the Caribbean, within the Cayman Islands, to make sure that the credit union voice was heard. So you'll see a link in the bottom right corner to that podcast. I hope folks go and look at that. But that was one example that I think others can learn from in terms of the actual advocacy process that folks are taking to make sure they're engaging with members. That was also one where, as they were doing their local work, they also asked for some collaboration from the World Council for a letter with many of the regional players, to make sure that that global network was felt at a local level. So it is sometimes helpful to say there are best practices we can draw from. We can say what the fees are in other systems, and this is far too high, as you can see globally, by those standards. And to say we're part of a network, we're not just an individual credit union, we're not one system here. We may not be individually as large, but collectively can come together to advocate together. So doing those joint letters to regulators to share the global perspective, coming together to really advocate as one, has been helpful throughout. So we just wanted to share one quick example. So with that, I think we will transition here. I'm very excited for David Malone, the CEO of the Irish League of Credit Unions, to be joining us to share a bit about their journey on advocacy and what they've been working on.
Thanks, Erin, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody, from whatever part of the world you're joining us in. Yeah, just on this slide, a very brief snapshot of the Irish credit union sector, which might help, I think, and put some context and background when maybe delving and double-clicking a bit further into the advocacy approach itself. There's a couple of financial stats there, but one stat, I suppose, well, two stats we're very proud of. The first one's around the membership. We have the highest penetration rate in the world, so the 60% of our population, 3.7 million members. So that's the highest in the world, something we're really proud of. And on top of that as well, we have a huge reputation as well. We've won the Customer Experience Award here in Ireland for 10 years in a row, and I believe that's unparalleled internationally. And on top of that as well, we've been voted #1 reputationally as well for a number of years too. And that's really important from an advocacy approach as well. We are looking for regulatory or legislative change to put that context on it. The other piece is probably very much around the evolution of the Irish credit union sector as well. We've 22 billion in assets, as you can see there. But what's interesting, I suppose, is our profile as well. Our loan to asset ratio is low. It's very much in stark contrast as opposed to our highest penetration rate in the world. Our loan to asset ratio is low at 33%. And there's certainly a need in Ireland, and this has been certainly happening over the last number of years, to increase our loan to asset ratio. And this is where I think Erin and Paul have touched so much on international comparisons and benchmarks. We've really learned from the strategy and development of very much advanced credit union sectors, in particular America, Canada, and Australia, and how, in terms of their lending, that a large portion of their lending is actually in mortgages. As you can see at the moment, 10% of our loan book is in mortgages. We certainly want to strive much forward to increase the footprint in that, and thereby also increasing the loan to asset ratio significantly of Irish credit union sector over the next number of years. And just moving on a little bit further, I suppose, and particularly looking at the European dimension in particular. So in terms of the European dimension, we are looking at some European regulations as well that are coming forward to us. And certainly we can see those in terms of FIDA, in terms as well of digital euro, but also in terms of PSD3. And that's very much a focus for us on that next slide, where we are really considering that context itself. And this is where I think it's not just about these regulations, it's about looking forward as well. And I think, to really acknowledge here the work of WACU and the European network of credit unions, who we're very proud members of. We and our colleagues in Europe, in Poland, North Macedonia, Croatia, and Romania, and Albania meet and discuss European issues and engage with European decision makers in relation to those particular matters themselves. Particularly, if I touch on a snapshot of that, we were in Brussels last November, and we had really high-level engagements with a number of people, particularly from the Central Bank of Ireland. We had engagement in terms of digital euro, but we also had engagement as well with senior officials in the ECB in Brussels, and also a number of EU Commission officials. And we complemented that as well, though, with the political spectrum, particularly meetings with members of the European Parliament, particularly those who have a European focus. Regina Doherty, one of our own MEPs, we met her. We had a very detailed discussion with her, particularly with her focus on, she's on the Special Committee of Housing. And we also met a number of other advisors as well, policy advisors to MEPs, particularly from an Irish context, but also in a European context, particularly with focuses on agriculture, housing, regional development, transport, and consumer protection. And I suppose the purpose of those meetings is, it's not about a photo call. It is very much about, as Erin and Paul have touched on, a couple of key aspects. The first one is about raising awareness of the sector and the Irish credit union sector and the European sector. The Irish credit union sector itself represents over 60% of the assets of the European sector. But it was more than that as well. It was talking particularly about those concepts that Paul touched on, of proportionality, particularly about credit unions are very different to banks. And very much early on in this presentation, we talked about that a lot of the regulations internationally are done from a large banking context. They sometimes disregard the credit union sector. So very much as part of this engagement, we're making it very clear that the credit union sector is very unique. And that's where proportionality and right-sizing regulations for credit unions is absolutely critical. We also did discuss as well aspects such as implementation timelines, particularly in terms of DORA is a great example of this, where the Digital Operational Resilience Act is hugely impactful for a number of financial services providers. And in Ireland, we got a member discretion on this, whereby for institutions such as banks, insurance companies, and investment firms, they had to apply DORA from the 17th of January 2025. And DORA is hugely impactful in terms of resourcing, particularly in terms of looking at risk management, in terms of third-party vendor management, and it has a huge impact on resourcing. But as I say, we got that derogation and membership state discretion, which means that from an Irish credit union perspective, we don't have to apply DORA until 1 January 2028, which gives us the opportunity to learn from the other financial institutions who are going through the pain now of implementing DORA and giving us that breathing space. It's still going to be a significant task, but I think it does show the importance of being out there at the front, edge when these regulations are being developed. And similarly, we have, usually positive discussions as well in terms of matters such as FIDA. FIDA also has a huge impact for us as well. That's the Financial Data Access Framework, and particularly how that will impact credit unions as well, particularly in terms of data portability, and also about the resourcing and time commitment that may be needed to take in place. And I want to compliment the WACU team as well for keeping us up to speed on this, because there's been a huge divergence in views on FIDA, and particularly in terms of the Council, the Parliament, and also the European Commission, all having very different views on the application of FIDA itself. And I think that's really important that we're kept up to speed on that. Obviously, from our point of view, and I've mentioned DORA and that membership discretion, member state discretion, we'd obviously want a similar approach adopted for FIDA as well. And that would certainly be our position. But again, it's so important to be out in front of these matters themselves. And similarly, just, in terms of digital euro, there's been a lot of talk about that from a European context. Yes, there's opportunities in it, and we do welcome it to an extent, but the holding amount that can be held in the digital euro is actually going to be vital. Our average savings in the Irish credit union sector are €4,800. There's talk about the holding limit being held in this digital euro being potentially €3,000. That's obviously something we wouldn't be happy with, and we are continuing to engage on that from an international context, but also from a European perspective and from a local perspective, ensuring that that is, addressed appropriately for Irish credit unions in particular. And that's really vital, I think, from the digital euro perspective, and to be in early doors in that conversation. This is what this is all about. It's about being in the early doors, being in the horizon scanning, and being, I suppose, very much from the proactive advocacy approach, because these European regulations do end up coming down to the local jurisdiction, and we have to be on the front foot on those. And I think that's very much our proactive approach here in the RC credit unions with the other European network of credit unions, and of course as well our WACU colleagues too. And maybe just touching finally then as well on the Irish agenda, and just briefly to touch on this, but there's a lot of international dimension to this as well. So very exciting time for us in Ireland. We've had legislation enacted both north and south. So we represent credit unions in the Republic of Ireland and also in Northern Ireland. And new legislation has been enacted in the Republic of Ireland. That's the first in over a decade. And in Northern Ireland, there's also commitment for new legislation as well, which would be the first in over 4 decades. So, hugely exciting moments. And some of the concepts coming in this new legislation that we've proactively engaged on are very much coming from our experience with other international jurisdictions, particularly the concept of credit union service organizations, the important role that they can play, particularly if you think back to my own context earlier on at the Irish credit union sector, and how if we want to diversify our lending in portfolio in particular, and implement new products and services, that the use of credit union service organizations is hugely important in that regard. And we've had many conversations with numerous credit union service organizations across, particularly America and Canada, in that regard. I'm excited to say there is already a payments current account credit union service organization in place, and a mortgage one has been established in the last 12 months as well. And again, that international research and engagement with WACU has been critical inputs into terms of the development of those aspects. Certainly, corporate credit unions is a new aspect of the legislation that provides a useful opportunity, particularly in terms of liquidity management. As we diversify our lending book and it becomes longer term and a longer maturity, then there is a need for a corporate credit union potentially to look at centralized liquidity as well. And that's an important aspect. And again, we've had numerous conversations in America, Canada, and Australia on this. And again, that network and opportunity that WACU provides is critical for us in terms of developing those thought processes. That's kind of it for myself, just as a wrap up. There's other concepts there in terms of referral members, loan participation, and lending limits. And again, I think what's been critical on those in particular, again, has been using international benchmarks. So when Paul, you spoke about the advocacy approach, and if I took lending limits maybe as the final piece here, this is the lending limits that were applied to Irish credit unions in terms of the quantum of lending they could do in terms of mortgages and business lending, particularly mortgages. It was quite restricted. We presented a position paper to the Irish credit union regulator, setting out a business case for a change, an increase in those limits. And what we used on that was 2 aspects that was critical. One was looking firstly, of course, at the banking sector in Ireland and how they can, the quantum that they can actually lend. But most importantly was also turning and focusing the light on other international credit union sectors, looking at their sustainable higher loan to asset ratios and drawing parallels to the need for a higher lending limit in Ireland to ensure that therefore we could build that business case and show that it had worked internationally in other places. And I'm pleased to announce that earlier this year, the Irish regulator confirmed they were going to change those limits significantly. And it was very much in the context of what we'd asked for. So very appreciative of all that support internationally, which has been vital in terms of that advocacy approach.
All really enlightening stuff from all of you, and thank you so much. And David, that was a great breakdown of your system and the way you guys have worked with us to influence different regulations that have you've had having to deal with now. And I want to ask a few questions. That we do have audience Q&A. If you have questions for Paul or David or Erin, if you're a member of ours and you have a question, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But I'll ask you first. You know, advocacy and policy making, they look pretty different across countries, but there's always some similarities. I'm wondering if Paul or Erin, you can share some of those similarities you've seen when speaking with policymakers and where credit unions can be effective in that.
Well, let me kick off, Greg, on that because there are some similarities, and I think there are some best practices that we've seen and in fact, David really touched on it in many respects, which is around building your reputation with the regulatory and policy making community. Regulators, and having served as a regulator for many years in my career, what we wanted and what regulators I think want are trusted partners. They really are much more skeptical of individuals coming in or groups coming in trying to essentially out and out lobby them. Now, they're used to it, they understand it, but I think it's clear that policymakers and regulators want to know, can we trust what these individuals are telling us? Is it really the way the operations work in a credit union? Is there credibility here? Is there an opportunity for real reputation building? And so it's a key component of how we have to do advocacy, and I think how local jurisdictions also need to do advocacy. So it's education, it's being upfront, it's being honest, and it's building that reputational capital. Because once you have that reputational capital, people will listen to you, particularly on the regulators, from the regulator side.
Yeah, and you know, maybe one thing to just add on to what Paul said, I think that's exactly right, is also that data and the stories, making sure you're sharing that credit union story, leveraging other perspectives from other jurisdictions. We are seeing, you know, in different pockets throughout the globe, regulators talking to other regulators and other supervisors from other countries. And so making sure that you're able to share those stories about best practices, sharing data. I know that's something that World Council is working on as well. I know it's tough sometimes when you get those calls about the statistical report to share data about how many credit unions you have, the state of some of them, but that data really does go to support our international advocacy efforts and is used at a national level by other credit union systems to make sure that they're telling that credit union story and backing it up not only with data, but then examples from either other jurisdictions or within their own about the impact that credit unions are having, because that's really fundamental to that credit union message to the regulators and the international standard setters, is that we do have a unique perspective within the financial ecosystem, and it's important to acknowledge that through the regulations as well.
Erin,
David,
that's
I want
such
to
a
ask.
good point.
Go ahead,
Oh,
Paul.
sorry, Greg. I was just going to say that Erin makes such a good point about the data because regulators today and policymakers, they say publicly and they say privately, we're data driven. We want to be data driven in our policy making, in our regulation. And so let's give them what they want. Let's give them what they need to be sure that they're making informed decisions about useful regulation that isn't overburdensome.
I think that's an excellent point, Paul, as well, because I think, you know, data, I use that terminology business case. And I think it's about making a business case to the regulator for change. And a business case, as we know, has to have data. It has to have hard facts within it. I think that's so essential. And that's something we've learned ourselves to really utilize our data, both internationally, but also from our local perspective, to prove the point, because that's so important. I mean, I think, from an advocacy perspective, we need to put ourselves in the regulator's shoes when we're looking at this. I think the other piece that we've learned as well is social impact. That yes, hard financial numbers are important, absolutely, but it's also about the social impact piece that's critical as well, and that uniqueness of credit unions and trying to measure that social impact, albeit time given by volunteers freely on their boards, to the impact on communities. There's certainly been a number of studies done by credit unions in Ireland where €1 invested in the credit union can have a multiplier effect because of the trickle down effect on the local community. And we certainly see that in Ireland. When you're going around Ireland, you won't see a town or village where there isn't any credit union. So there's definitely the financial data piece in terms of the business case, but there's also the social impact piece, that story element as well.
David, I'll stay with you. You've covered some of this, but you're in such a unique position in the European Union. You mentioned the penetration rate that Ireland has, largest in the world in terms of how many people are members of credit unions there. There's so many credit unions. How do you approach the EU? Because they're often pretty out front on changing regulations. Others tend to follow their lead sometimes. So how do you approach engaging with their policymakers and advocating?
Yeah, very much proactively, Greg. I think that's effectively what we'd say first. Also, that proactive engagement. It's trying to get to the right key decision makers. Certainly, when we were in Brussels the last couple of times, we've certainly tried to link in as well with Irish MEPs, from the Ireland context, and build relationships with them, because that's critical. I think they understand the Irish context. But it's also about informing them what the Irish credit union sector is about. I remember having a meeting with an MEP 2 years ago and talking about the size of the Irish credit union sector in terms of 22 billion of assets, which, yeah, small from American context, but it's over 6% of, say, the European context. They didn't even fully appreciate that, even the Irish MEPs, that context. So that was really important, I think, to do. It is about being proactive. It's about horizon scanning. It's about being aware of what's going on and coming downstream. But I think I'd love to manage as well our colleagues in Europe from the European Network of Credit Unions, because I've spoken a lot about America, Canada, and Australia, but actually some great examples as well of some of our team, our directors, and our head of advocacy, Barry Harrington, who went over to North Macedonia last year. And they shared, very importantly, the context of the Irish credit union system with the North Macedonia officials. North Macedonia were liberalising very much around the payment services that could be provided by the saving houses in North Macedonia. North Macedonia being a smaller sector than the Irish credit union sector, but has so much in common in terms of the ethos. So we certainly drew parallels in terms of how we operate in Ireland, how the impact that credit unions can have when there is proportionate regulation in place. And that really was very fundamental to changes in the banking laws in North Macedonia that did subsequently transpire. So that's where we can share knowledge east and west of Ireland, I suppose. And we've done similar approaches as well with our colleagues in Croatia, again, using the Irish system, to show where success can be achieved and making that case to, regulators where there's some severe regulations, I think, in other jurisdictions in Europe. And to show that, some proportionate change in those regulations can ultimately have a positive impact on people's lives and can also promote competition on a safe and prudent basis. So I think, it's been really good stories in the European Network Credit Union context, both ways.
And Greg, what David says is just so important because it goes to the credibility and the reputational issue. And what you don't hear credit unions saying is, don't regulate us. What we do say is, regulate us because we know it's important, but do it in an appropriate, proportional way. And that's different. That's very different in many respects than what you hear from the banks and the banking lobbyists and things of that nature, where they don't regulate this aspect of our business or don't regulate this aspect. And that's not what credit unions are. And that's such an important point that David raises.
Let's switch a little bit and have you share. If I'm wondering if each of you has maybe an advocacy best practice that either you've learned from engaging with the international credit union system or the international credit union setters, international standard setters, I should say. Are there some best practices that people watching this can kind of take away from each of you?
I'll kick off. Do you want to kick? I'll kick off there if that's okay. Yeah, I think there's a few, Greg. I think I think I mentioned Dora, I suppose, right at the outset there, and this is a great example of a number of years of very hard work from colleagues here for the Irish credit union sector in Ireland, DORA is hugely intensive impact on financial institutions in terms of digital operational resilience. It's hugely intrusive, lots of significant resources required, and we're seeing that particularly in our banking sector colleagues here. Big banks, have 30 or 40 people working in the bank, actually dedicated to the implementation of this DORA. And as I say, it was due to be implemented on 17th of January, and there's certainly a time frame in place for the banks to actually be compliant with that. So, a number of years ago, the RC credit unions with WACU and NCU worked very hard to get that member state discretion on DORA. And that was critical, because we're now at a juncture where, yes, going back to what Paul said, of course we want to be meeting consumer needs. So the Irish credit union sector fully realizes that it should implement DORA, and it's agreed to implement it from 1 January 28. But the beauty of what the advocacy approach has achieved here, it's giving us a timeline to 1 January 28 to prepare for DORA, and also to learn from what's going on in the banking sector and how they are impacted at the moment, learning best practice and learning from their mistakes and learning from how they can address it, and then we can learn and build on that. And that's a huge achievement, I think, in terms of what we're doing. So it does bring very much both of the sides of the coin. Yes, we do we're not fighting against these regulations. We accept, a number of them are needed. They fit very much in with our future, but we do need proportionality and timelines to implement them. And no better example of that, I think, than the DORA approach.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And I think that's also a nice example of, as you're getting, if you have more products and services, as you're growing as a system, some of these regulatory considerations become much more complicated. And it does take that additional effort and really zoning in on what it means for credit unions to dissect that. Maybe flipping to the other side to build off what David and Paul have both said, there are other systems too that are in different places that are really working, that have too little regulation, honestly, that organizations and entities are able to call themselves credit unions without really much oversight or without restriction, and has caused challenges in other systems in terms of how do they get the right regulatory framework set up for their systems. So sometimes credit unions are regulated with banks and under their same code. Sometimes they have their own individual act specifically for credit unions, and sometimes they're regulated with other cooperatives, even those that aren't accessing financial services. So they're kind of lumped into a different category that maybe doesn't fit quite right for what they're looking for. So there are a lot of systems really working to make sure that that regulatory framework is strong, so that they can ensure protection for their members and consumers, throughout their community. And so one takeaway there is something to learn absolutely from everyone, from all different stages of their advocacy regulatory frameworks, and really that commitment to sticking with it, to building the long-term relationships with the regulators. Sometimes it's a big change in getting a whole new act. Sometimes it's incremental changes to pointing out, finding a problem, and then presenting a solution, presenting a way forward that is a regulatory language that is acceptable to both the regulators and the credit union. So I really have to acknowledge Nepal in this case. They've gone through a lot of changes and a lot of challenges within their system, but have worked so hard as a system to really put forward stronger regulatory frameworks. And that's still in the process. They're still building out administrative rules and other things, but have had some huge successes over the last 12 months with getting new credit union acts, new regulators installed specifically to look at their system and make sure that it's structured in a way that's beneficial for everyone.
Yeah, Greg, that's such an important point. And I would say, just from my experience, it's vital that any advocacy effort acknowledges the challenge that the policymaker or the regulator has. And understanding, and it's almost empathy, I guess, is perhaps, maybe that's an overstatement a little bit, but it's acknowledging what they're concerned about. And then, as Erin said, come up with a win-win solution. What I've seen so many times is where advocates come in and will say, you're wrong, you don't understand our business, and et cetera, et cetera. And that sets up a terrible dynamic, frankly, from the get-go. And that's really not where I think credit unions want to be, and nor are they most of the time. So it's acknowledge, and then propose. And I think when you do that, that helps build that credibility. It helps build that reputation. And over time, successes will come. They absolutely will.
And that's also not
You
to
know,
say really quick that there are valid challenges sometimes within the regulatory framework. And I know credit unions feel them on an operational level as they're trying to help their members. And so it is important, as Paul mentioned, to find that balance, because there are times where perhaps it is not the right situation. And so you have to fight a bit harder, and there are other forces outside of the regulators, other financial institution groups, others that may be, proposing challenges and things like that. So I think it's one to easier said than done, but still an important point to remember, even as we're continuing kind of that hard fight there too, in many cases where there's other extenuating circumstances to challenge the operational
I
balance.
think something we found there as well, really connected to that as well, is when talking to the regulator, it's so important to talk about the impact, the strategic plan. What is the strategic vision for the credit union sector? So, and to really build on that, and it's part of that relationship building, to share that freely and openly with the regulator, to be clear in terms of what the vision is. So if we're looking for, a regulatory or advocacy change, why is that really? Are we just asking for it, or is it linked into the strategic vision of the credit union sector itself? Where is the strategy of the sector going? Certainly in an Irish context, we've a commitment from the government here to support us and co-sponsor a development of a 5-year strategic plan for the Irish credit union sector. That's huge in terms of building that forward. And then ultimately, I think as well, along with the strategic vision and plan, is actually linking this back to the customer or the member, as you touched on, Erin, the member. Why is this in the interest of the general public, this particular regulatory or advocacy change? And that's where we found very helpful as well with wider consumer research, not just members of credit unions, but actually consumers, the public, as to what their views are. Why do they want these extra products and services? Do they want that from a credit union? Do they feel there's adequate competition in the marketplace at the moment? There isn't in Ireland. We've only 2.5 banks effectively. So building that consumer research piece, putting the voice of the consumer there as part of the advocacy change linked into the strategy can also, I think, be a very powerful part of the story.
We're all going to be gathering in Stockholm next month. I know all of us will be there for the World Credit Union Conference, 20th anniversary. And this is the largest number of breakout sessions we've ever had on advocacy and regulatory developments. We're going to have 7 of them. We've got some internationally known speakers who are going to be there on the at least internationally known on the regulatory side and advocacy side. What do you hope members take away from the conference? I'll kind of start with you, Paul, since I know that you and Erin have been spearheading this for the last few months.
One of the things I hope attendees take away is that the complexity of some of the issues that other jurisdictions are dealing with, whether they're a large jurisdiction, a small jurisdiction, or somewhere in between, that the issues around the world, while there's a lot of similarities, maybe it's around use of artificial intelligence, or maybe it's around climate regulation or things of that nature, but these issues are complex. And what we're hoping to do is to provide at least some clarity about where internationally some of these issues are trending, and perhaps some solutions in some cases, depending on the issue or the panel that we're talking about. And we hope people understand from the global perspective the importance of meeting and sharing these stories, because we do learn from one another. And that's what I think is so critical about the World Credit Union Conference.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that's exactly right. And first and foremost, I hope everyone takes back some strong educational learnings. We really took the topics and created those topics and those sessions based off of member questions, member needs, member feedback, throughout the year of what's rising in different systems. And of course, there is that complexity. So you have a wide range of emerging technology regulations and also good governance practices, different sessions to really speak to a lot of different systems. But also, I hope everyone has the opportunity, before and after those sessions, attend those sessions and look around who else is in the room. Those are people that are probably also working on regulatory practices or thinking about their advocacy, thinking about how they interact with regulators in their own system. And there's so many good best practices to be shared and networks to gain by having those conversations at the conference as well.
David, you're muted.
Right. Yeah. The conference I think is just a huge opportunity. I think Paul and Erin have touched on that so well. I think from my own perspective, this is my third one I'm attending, and I found it just a hugely beneficial conference from many different aspects. And just to touch on this from an Irish context, that's okay. Firstly, in terms of our own conference, we developed our own conference in Ireland, and we very much used the format and structure and style of the WACU conference as an indicator of that, very much with breakout sessions and a main stage. So just found that interaction really positive. I think the piece that Paul touched on as well, what strikes me is the art of the possible. I think what this conference shows is, and this certainly showed to me when I came for the first time 3 years ago, is it is possible, and I think you can see other jurisdictions that have advanced, how they've got real regulatory change, how they've achieved that, and how you can model that as well yourself in your own locality. So that's a real positive I take out of it. The other thing that's always struck me from WACU, which is really great, is the networking, obviously. But it's okay, there may be different levels of development in different jurisdictions. There might be different sizes, but we've so much in common. In fact, we've still got that uniqueness in common. We've that credit union ethos and principles. They're the same among all of us who attend this conference. And I think that's the piece. It brings the family together and it shows what's possible. From base yourself on those principles, stay true to those principles, and then how you can learn from the advocacy approach. And I think as well, just finally to touch on as well, is regulators are there as well. I think our own Irish regulator will be in attendance this time. And as well, we have regulators from ICARN, International Credit Union Regulators Network. I did have many conversations with them last year as well, usually helpful. So I think the wide amount of stakeholders who are there is usually helpful as well. And I think you really do come away with real tangible outputs that you can bring home and really make some changes.
Well, we have one question for the audience here. Charity asks, sharing our stories is key to our survival in the face of disproportionate regulations. However, some national credit unions in some jurisdictions are unwilling to share, especially their surplus gains, for fear that regulators descending on them with unreasonable taxes and other unfavorable regulations will be the result. Is this something that any of you have seen as well? And I guess if that is the case, what would you say to those credit union systems that are afraid to do that?
Certainly from an Irish context, it's helpful. First of all, just from an Irish context, we're always free, very free in terms of sharing the information among Irish credit unions. We have the Pearls data, which we compile for credit unions. My colleague Dave Houston does that, and then we circumvent that to credit unions so they can measure themselves against different groups in terms of groups of credit unions of similar size, maybe industrial location and so on, and measure themselves in terms of performance. So they find that usually beneficial. We're very open about the financial results of the sector. We issue them every quarter to the general public here, and it gives us an opportunity not just to talk about the financial results, but also talk about the credit union difference itself and what we're trying to strategically focus on for credit unions. So I think I'd always encourage that collaboration, which is a big word here in Ireland. I'm sure it's in other jurisdictions. Collaboration is the way forward for credit unions. I think trying to share information to help the whole sector is really the way forward.
I think my advice in this kind of instance would be to turn it around into a positive, to help or try to encourage these systems to disclose this information and use it as an argument about why they're increasing or why they have sufficient capital, for example, to meet their capital requirements, and how they're using these extra surpluses to lower interest rates on loans and raise interest rates for savings and things of that nature. So it's a positive story, I would think, for the policymakers and the regulators. And it's, I guess, one of those things where it's education, but in a very positive way that I think could be used in convincing people why this is a good story to tell.
Yeah, I think, both of that's exactly right. But, and things to Charity too. I think it's such a great comment because it does highlight there are different situations for different systems, and that credit union systems are facing different challenges depending on their system and where they're located. And so I think it's an important point too on there are commonalities across both where we have seen some other systems being challenged with sudden increased fees. So they've really, that was the Cayman Islands example. There are other systems out there that have also faced, sudden increase in fees and have really had to do a lot on the advocacy side to really show the support from the community and how important that institution is and that they cannot operate the way they are with some of those really high fees. And I think the important distinction too, as Paul and David were getting to, so not for profit doesn't mean that you're not earning profit within the credit union system. You're reinvesting that back into your systems. It's not going to a handful of shareholders. It's not going to 5 or 10 people to actually profit off of. You're reinvesting that into lower rates, lower fees, better access to financial services, more modernizing systems. So it is a challenge I think that credit unions are facing across the globe in terms of making sure that that story is told in terms of how we reinvest back in the system, where the profits actually go. Capital to make sure that we are really safe and sound and operating in a level that's really advantageous to the global kind of economic movement within that country, but also that we are filling that gap in what we're doing with that. And so it is a challenge for sure, but making sure, yes, we're disclosing, but also telling that story of how it's reaching that impact and what that actually means in turn for the credit union system. That's a great comment.
One final question for you from me. Will any of you be available for autographs in Stockholm? Oh, Erin did not like that question.
Only David, the real rock star.
That's right.
Well, thank you all. Great informative session. I think everybody's got a lot out of this. If you're watching it, you want someone else to watch it. I want to let you know that you can watch it again on our YouTube channel. We're going to have it up later today. That's at youtube.com/Woku. Again, it's going to be available later today at youtube.com/Woku. We were talking about the World Credit Union Conference. If you want to participate in it and be there for more advocacy sessions, we're hosting it in Stockholm, Sweden. As we mentioned, it's the 20th anniversary this year from July 14th to the 16th. It is the premier global credit union event every year. And the theme this year is the future is cooperative, in line with the International Year of Cooperatives. Simply scan the QR code on your screen right now to register. If you don't have the phone handy, head to wcuc.org to learn more and register for, I tell you what, promises to be a historic event. We would love to see all of you there this summer. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Have a great day.